Hey guys, Dr. Snellgrove here, just recording a quick video on the Sounds of Poetry, poetry unit section for our Composition 2 class. So this is going to be, I was going to say short and sweet. I guess we'll see how short it is, but really got like 5 poems that I'd like us to go over of how to put this. 4 of them have a very, very clear theme. The other one is just one that I liked, and it was also the return of one of our first poets, or I should say, one of the poets that we first covered in here. So I was hoping that you guys might enjoy it. So, wanted to start out. This is Rita Dove's Pedestrian Crossing, Charlottesville. And so, if the name doesn't immediately ring a bell, Rita Dove was the writer of Daystar, that cheerful poem where the speaker is like, oh, I have no time to myself. I just sit behind the garage for like 1 hour until the kid wakes me up. Yeah, that kind of stuff. So she's got a very different kind of poem here. I guess it's in the eye of the beholder. It's in your eye, whether this is an equally, sad or cynical poem. So let's just dive right into it. So a gaggle of girls giggles over the bricks leading off Court Square. We break dutifully and wait, but there's at least 20 of these knob-kneed creatures, blonde and curly, still at an age that thinks impudence is cute. Look how they dart and dither, changing flanks as they lurch along, golden gobbets of infuriating foolishness or pure joy, depending on one's disposition. At the moment, mine's sour. This is taking far too long. Don't they have minders? Just behind my shoulder in the city park, the Southern General still stands, stonewalling us all. When I was their age, I judged Goldilocks nothing more than a pint-sized criminal who flounced into others' lives, then assumed their clemency. Unfair, I know, my aggression, to lump them into a gaggle, silly geese, when all they're guilty of is being young. So far. So it's a poem. I like this poem personally because it's an interesting mixture of like playfulness and cynicism, you could say. So for instance, there's a lot, when I say playfulness, there's a lot of wordplay going on here. We start the poem out with alliteration. A gaggle of girls giggles, gug gug gug. So that's deliberate, creates that kind of lyrical quality that alliteration always creates. We get a little more of that a few lines down. Golden gobbets, she says. And there's also, of course, lots of playful, she mentioned. So again, the poem is called Pedestrian Crossing, Charlottesville, referring to South Carolina town. And so there's the bit, just behind my shoulder in the city park, the Southern General still stands, stonewalling us all. So, she's obviously talking about, Stonewall Jackson, that kind of stuff. But there's also the idea he's a statue. He's a statue. He's staring at you. You're not going to get any kind of reaction from him. So in a kind of literal sense, he is stonewalling you, right? So lots of playfulness in here. And then but there's also something that is very, I don't know, very blunt, very as a middle-aged person, I guess this resonates with me a little more because mechanically, what's happening in the poem, she sees some girls, at a pedestrian crossing, and just they're annoying her, almost immediately. As soon as she sees them, she's describing them as knob-kneed creatures, still at an age that thinks impudence is cute. So she's made up her mind about these kids like right away, right? Just made up her mind right away about them. So you could say, we could put on our psychology hats here and say that she's telling us maybe a little more. The speaker is telling us a little more about herself than she really is telling us about the kids. And she admits that, though, right? I love this bit where it's like how she describes the kids. Golden gobbets of infuriating foolishness or pure joy, depending on one's disposition. At the moment, mine's sour. So she's acknowledging, like, kind of halfway through the poem, like, look, other people would think the kids are being cute and precocious, and I'm just in a bad mood. I want to cross this damn, pedestrian crossing right here. But she has more of that too, where it's like, when I was their age, I judged Goldilocks nothing more than a pint-sized criminal. And so there is a, what do you call it? There is an idea there of Again, instant judgment. Presumably she hasn't talked to these girls. She hasn't had any kind of interaction with them. But it's like, I bet you're the kind of person that liked Goldilocks. And it's such a wild. I was joking about this with a face-to-face class. It reminded me of the old Twitter thing, making up a guy and then getting mad at him. So it's like making up, not making up the children, but at least making up the children's mentality. It's like, oh, I bet you like Goldilocks. So I was your age. I was too smart for that. It's like, okay, we're getting some projection, coming from our speaker. Some of her own issues being projected on the young girls here. And then we had a little more aggression. That's a Freudian slip. A little more alliteration towards the end, along with an interesting kind of, I don't know if you call it a tag ending, but it's definitely an ending meant to make us think. It says, unfair, I know my aggression to lump them into a gaggle, silly geese, when all they're guilty of is being young so far. So you get more alliteration there, right? Gaggle, geese, guilty, all very close together. But at the same time, it's also like wordplay within wordplay. She jokes about lumping them into a gaggle, and then in parentheses, silly geese. Of course, that is a group of geese is a gaggle. So, the poet is having fun the whole time. But she has this ending that is, maybe cynical, maybe just practical. All they're guilty of is being young so far. So the idea that, like, she's willing to admit that, the kids didn't really do anything wrong. They're just young, rambunctious, playful, whatever. At the same time, that's not the same thing as saying they'll be innocent forever. And I was telling a class earlier, this always reminds me of one of my former kind of mentors here, a professor I spoke to quite a bit, and he was talking about our, increasingly many of our own students were not as young as these girls, obviously, but we, thanks to dual enrollment and CHS, we'd have a lot of 15, 16-year-old students, which is kind of crazy. And so one day he told me, he's like, Chris, the only problem with these kids is they just haven't lived that long. And I think about that sometimes, the idea that, like, hey, on one hand, that's not anything you can change. The only way through it is to live more. But on the other hand, it's a reminder to be kind of merciful, gracious, just less judgmental. The idea of the perceived transgressions of youth. Let young people be young. Let young people have their fun. They got their whole lives to grow old and cynical like this guy. All right. So speaking of old and cynical here, so the next poem up, like I said, I mentioned this earlier. The first poem is just kind of like an outlier, but the next four poems are all different variations, different views of war. And so wanted to read you, this is Alfred Lord Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade. It is one of the more famous poems, and I think famous should have a little asterisk by it almost, because you may not know it by name, you may not know the poet by name, but there are one or two bits in here that I'm willing to bet you've heard quoted in different contexts at different times. So let's dive right into it. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Ford the light brigade, charge the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Ford the light brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabers bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabering the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the saber stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made. Honor the light brigade, noble 600. All right. So I wanted to contextualize just what the heck is going on in here, in case you were curious. And so the name gives us our most powerful hint as to the nature and the tragedy of this poem. So it's a light brigade. So if you didn't pick up on this from the context clues of the story, they are like, a brigade that is armed just with swords. That's why it's talking about their sabers in there. And they are mistakenly, like bad orders, they are mistakenly sent up against an enemy force that has like a bunch of cannons, so it's the worst kind of mismatch. The light brigade is fighting the heavy brigade. They people joke about bringing a knife to a gunfight. Well, these guys brought their swords to a cannon fight. And so a lot of this is about, just the tragedy of, they're going into, it just says at the mouth of hell, how bad it is. And it's like 600 of them ride out. And then at the end, then they rode back, but not the 600. So the idea that, they may have won, sort of, but at what cost? How many of them died due to what was bad orders? And the bad orders bit is super explicitly in the poem, right? This is pretty early on. This is like the second stanza. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. So it's like, okay, someone screwed up to give the order to send us against them. And then this is one of the famous bits of the poem that I said that this often gets quoted, sometimes misquoted or changed up a little bit, but theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. And so one of the reasons I like this poem personally is I think it kind of rides the line between, it wants to honor the soldiers. Tennyson would have been a respect the troops guy in his time, but at the same time, it's like it's okay to criticize the terrible like military leadership that got all these people killed. And so, he makes it very clear that, okay, we can't blame the, what do you call it? We can't blame the soldiers. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. It's like, hey, they don't come up with the orders, they execute the orders. So if terrible orders are getting these characters killed, these characters, they are characters, I guess, but if they're getting these soldiers killed, then that's a problem. Someone screwed up. And so I just wanted to mention that because, like I said, well, slight spoilers for the poems we're going to get into in just a minute. But how to put this? Like most of the poems in the book are very firmly for or against the war. And I know that this is going to come as a great shock to you guys. Like, poems are typically written by hippie, liberal arts types. Your book is collected, put together by hippie liberal arts types. So shockingly, most, not so shockingly, most of the poems are pretty anti-war. Some of them much more stridently than others. But in this particular case, right, we've got the idea that, okay, yes, I think, well, he, the speaker, thinks you should honor the soldiers. That's the very end of it. Literally the last two lines. Well, let's go with the last three lines. Honor the charge they made. Honor the light brigade, noble 600. So it's like, hey, you better not forget what they did. You better not forget the sacrifice of those who lived, and especially those who died. Honor the light brigade. At the same time, though, Tennyson is very clear: someone blundered, someone screwed this up. Someone sent good men into the mouth of hell, and most of them didn't come back. So very, very cheerful stuff as always. And our next poem, I was going to say, I guess maybe it is more cheerful. It's also most likely military propaganda. We'll get to it. But the next poem is Jesse Pope's "The Call." And so there's a lot of interesting, a lot of ways to interpret this, of course, but I wanted to give you some context before we dive in. So this is the first of, I think, two World War I poems we're going to look at. So obviously Charged Light Brigade was a bit earlier. Now we're talking about World War I. And so this poem, it seems to be, if nothing else, like an older man talking to a younger man, because we have this you're going to hear it here in a minute as I read it, laddie, 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 referring to a boy or young man, as opposed to, lass or lassie, which would be a young woman. So I guess we'll just dive right into it and talk a little bit about what it most likely means. All right, so who's for the trench, are you, my laddie? Who'll follow French, will you, my laddie? Who's fretting to begin? Who's going out to win? Who wants to save his skin? Do you, my laddie? Who's for the khaki suit? Are you, my laddie? Who longs to charge and shoot? Do you, my laddie? Who's keen on getting fit? Who means to show his grit? And who'd rather wait a bit? Would you, my laddie? Who'll earn the empire's thanks? Will you, my laddie? Who'll swell the victor's ranks? Will you, my laddie? When that procession comes, banners and rolling drums, who'll stand and bite his thumbs? Will you, my laddie? So there's a lot of stuff that is going on in this poem. So again, it's basically a World War I era poem talking about like, hey, are you going to sign up? Are you going to join the war? And it's not a very how to put it. It's not a very subtle poem. I guess that's a theme of an unintended theme of this unit is that it is not too subtle when it comes to being for or against war. So this poem, you could interpret it different ways. I've had some interesting conversations with the face-to-face students, but the general consensus among readers and critics alike is this is basically low-key, maybe more like high-key propaganda. And so it's like, hey, are you going to be the one that, puts on the uniform? Are you going to be the one that, goes out and fights the enemy? And then there's these teasing bits in there that basically remind the reader of the alternative and how it would be like a shameful thing. Who wants to save his skin? Do you, my laddie? Who'd rather wait a bit? Would you, my laddie? Who'll stand and bite his thumbs? Will you, my laddie? So the idea that it's propaganda, because it's like, hey, it's not. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on British history or anything, but I don't really think they had a draft per se. It was just people would sign up. Do you want to serve? And it was very much. I mean, this may or not go without saying, but there was very much a shame component if you did not want to serve. If you're, for whatever reason, it could be like a conscientious objector or whatever. The general idea, like in the culture of the time, is like, oh, you're a wimp. I had a very blunt student today. It's like, yeah, the people that she was like, yeah, the people that didn't want to go fight, everyone could say they're a pussy. It's like, well, you're not wrong. They might not have used that language in jolly old England 100 years ago, but yeah, that was the general thrust of it. Is you can be a brave soldier or you can be a coward. So which is it? Which way, Western man? And so yeah, it's a good poem in its way. It's very interesting. You can probably tell again. The main theme of all the poems today is like the sounds of poetry. So in the Charge of the Light Brigade, cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon, volley, thunder. So when you're saying it out loud, it's almost like you're emulating those cannon blast that's going out. This poem, it almost sounds like a drill sergeant maybe or something like that. Are you? Who's for the trench? Are you, my laddie? Who'll follow French? Will you, my laddie? Who's fretting to begin? Who's going out to win? Who wants to save his skin? Do you, my laddie? So that repetition of "Do you, my laddie? Do you, my laddie?" gives the poem this sort of lyrical quality. But also, I mean, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I can very clearly envision, what that, I can envision somebody saying this. I can envision somebody getting the drill sergeant style, will you, my laddie? Will you, my laddie? Style thing. So yeah, I'm hopefully not giving the poem too short a shrift, but I was going to move on to the next one that is much meatier, much more famous, and depending on your own perspectives towards war, it might be one you're a little more sympathetic with. All right. So we've had poets basically responding to poets before, right? We talked about how you have Christopher Marlowe writing his poem about, you know, the passionate shepherd, to the nymph, and then like the nymph's reply, that kind of stuff. And so Wilfred Owen, he's not like calling the other poet, he's not calling Jesse Pope out by name, but pretty much everyone that was writing that kind of wartime propaganda. Because of course the other one, I mean, maybe I shouldn't have backed out of it so quickly. The other poem is very explicitly like, you better be willing to fight and even die for your country. You know, who will earn the empire's thanks? Will you, my laddie? Who'll swell the victor's ranks? Will you, my laddie? And so the idea, like it's good to fight for your country. It's good even to die for your country, because the alternative is that you're a coward, and there's nothing worse than that. That's the general thrust of that. So then the poet Wilfred Owen, he comes in kind of like a wrecking ball here, where he's got another. This poem is called Dulce Decorum Est. We'll talk about the meaning here in a moment. But this is his really brutal account of like, hey, what was it actually like, in World War I? What was it like to serve? Because all these poets, all had these fancy ideas of its glory. It's going to be honorable. I'm going to prove myself a warrior on the battlefield. Now, Wilfred Owen, I don't mind telling you, unlike most of the poets in your book, he went to war. So, like, it is important to remember that in poems, the speaker is not always the same as the poet. With that being said, Wilfred Owen is not just writing about how war, specifically World War I, is held. He is drawing on some of his own personal experience to do it. So we're about to dive in. I did want to mention, just to, because the whole poem builds up to the end of it. The title, Dulce Decorum Est, is part of a larger phrase that is at the end of the poem, Dulce Decorum Est pro patria mori. And your book will probably give you a translation for that, but it's basically like, it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. And what's fascinating, at least to me, because I have no life, about this is that's a Latin phrase. It's not just any Latin phrase. Like the Roman poet Horace said that. So it's like, oh, he's trying to unpack, and he's trying to deprogram us from propaganda that stretches back to, ancient Rome. And so let's see how he does it. All right. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, Dulce Decorum Est pro patria mori. So it's brutal. It is brutal in its vivid, graphic, grotesque detail. But of course, that's the point. He's reacting again to poets like Jesse Pope that, what's their description of war? Like, you're going to get to wear a uniform. You're going to get to shoot a gun. You're going to prove yourself. Maybe you'll get a medal. That idea of what war is like. And he's like, hey, let me tell you exactly what it's like when the mustard gas starts flying. Let me tell you exactly what it's like when, your friend can't get a seal on in time and you watch him basically drown outside of water. Let me tell you about my post-traumatic stress disorder. course, back then they would have just called that shell shock. But let me tell you about the fact that I'm haunted by the sight of that dying guy every single night. It's a lot. It's a lot that is going on here, and it all builds to that gut punch of an ending. If you knew all this, if you had the kind of dreams I had, if you had the experiences I had, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie dulce decorum est pro patria more. That, hey, it's good to die for your country. If you knew what this war was like, if you knew what the fighting and suffering and death was like, you would not tell this lie. And it's kind of depressing that, like, I feel personally, some of my students said this today too, this poem still feels weirdly resonant because we're not doing World War I era style war anymore. You're not, a soldier doesn't have to fear mustard gas, generally speaking. But at the same time, there is still this idea, hey, it's good to die for your country. It's noble to sacrifice yourself, for your country if need be, that kind of thing. There's that old saying that, the tree of liberty, must be watered from time to time with the blood of patriots. There's a lot of people that still, in these modern times, unironically believe that. And so I'm not saying you can't believe that or shouldn't believe it, but here's Wilfred Owen coming in like a wrecking ball. Like, that's a lie, man. You don't know what fighting's like. And he doesn't explicitly say this, but I do think there's an implicit thing in here that it's usually older people that are spreading that lie. Like who is it that's saying, it's good to fight and die for your country? It's usually one of our octogenarian, even nonagenarian politicians, right? The idea, it's like, it's very easy for old men to send young men to war. It's very easy for old politicians to, get young soldiers killed to help improve their election chances, stuff like re-election, that kind of thing. So it's like, oh, here, Wilfred Owen, I'm not trying to sweet talk you on him if you didn't love the poem or whatever, but in my always humble opinion, he has not been dethroned yet. Like, when it comes to anti-war poetry, when it comes to let me tell you how bad this really was, he is unbeaten. Just that I'm still like, I'm a little worried. I'm not gonna be haunted my whole life, but I'm a little worried I might have nightmares tonight after reading his vivid description of the the fellow soldier dying, the writhing white eyes they could see after they flung him in the wagon. And why is he in the wagon? That's where the dead people go. And he's not dead yet, but he's about to be. So just a very brutal, very in your face. Like, no, if you wanna serve, if you wanna fight, you need to know how this really is instead of how they tell you it is. All right. So one last poem. We're rounding out our quartet of war poems here with one that's a bit more modern, as you can tell. So we had one from like Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem was about like the 19th century, I believe. That we've got two poems from World War I, so give or take like 100 years ago. And then this is obviously a much more modern one because it's talking about our modern warfare, drones. One of the reasons, I was not trying to sound cavalier, but it's like, modern soldiers don't, have to worry as much about stuff like mustard gas is in many times, boots on the ground would be a last option. It's like, hey, it's the 21st century, baby. We got robots for everything. So let's see what this poet has to say about Ode to a Drone. Hellraiser, razor-feathered risers, wind over Beshuar, powers joystick blithe, 1,000-mile scythe, proxy executioners, proxy acts pinged by a proxy server, winged victory, pilot cipher, unburdened by aught but fuel and bombs, fool of God, savage, idiot savant, sucking your benumbed trigger finger, gamer's thumb. Tell us how you really feel, poet, right? So obviously you don't have to agree with this. I feel like I'm saying that more and more. But, this is a poem. Like I said, most poems in your book, if they talk about war at all, they're going to take a firm stance for or against it. And probably 99 times out of 100, it's going to be against it. And so here it's like I do like the tight construction of this, where it's we have these 3-line stanzas here. And sometimes you get some rhyming, sometimes you don't. But the whole thing has a kind of smooth quality that doesn't disguise the vitriol of this, right? Powers joystick Blythe 1,000-mile scythe. So I'm not going to make, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this poem, but there's already a lot that's going on there, right? So when you are blithe to something, I will shamelessly give you guys a dictionary definition, so you don't have to figure old man rambling. Showing a casual and cheerful indifference considered to be callous or improper. So the idea that, somebody that is, this is a common criticism, somebody that is a drone pilot might be joystick blithe. Hey, you're not making, you're not on the ground making a call of whether to shoot, whether to, engage, that kind of thing. You're flying, thousands of feet in the air. It's like, all right, target's there, and bomb. So according to him, joystick Blythe 1,000-mile scythe. So I do love that combination there, because it's like it's describing the drone pilots as being joystick blithe, like you're indifferent, you shouldn't be, but also describing the drones themselves as a 1,000-mile scythe, which normally that would be something of an oxymoron, right? Like, a scythe is like what the Grim Reaper has. So there's only so much room, for a scythe. It's got to be at least one D&D player out there. Actually, it has reach, but now modern warfare, the actual concept, not the game, is like, oh yeah, we're just bombing stuff from 1,000 miles away. And there's still, as grim and everything as the poem is, it still has some interesting wordplay kind of in the middle. Proxy executioners, proxy acts pinged by a proxy server. And so you're getting, weirdly enough, the echoes of Alfred Lord Tennyson are still being heard here, because it's describing like what now the drone itself, like someone else is piloting this drone. So what does that make the drone, the machine? A proxy executioner. Nobody is there to directly pull the trigger. So instead, the drone functions as a proxy executioner's proxy acts. All right. So the idea of like, oh, hey, it's a person millions really, of miles away that is like, I'm the proxy executioner, this is my weapon. Basically, I mean, he says it at the very end, so it's not a very subtle thing, but basically this is an ongoing description of and criticism of war as a video game. Proxy executioners, proxy acts pinged by a proxy server. And then, so that idea that like all the humanity of war, maybe that's an oxymoron in and of itself, but all the humanity of war has been drained out of it. And then he has a lot of smoke here at the end. The poet has a lot of smoke for the actual pilot too. So it's one of those, what do you call it? One of those poems where Alfred Lord Tennyson was very sympathetic to the idea of like, oh, these are just the soldiers. Theirs is not to reason why, theirs is but to do and die. But this poet, he comes in and he talks about the pilot, the drone pilot, right? Unburdened by anything but fuel and bombs, fool of God, savage, idiot, savant. And so the idea, again, not a very subtle poem, the idea that a soldier on the ground is burdened by a lot of stuff, the physical burdens of the weapons and all the gear that they are carrying, but also burdened by rules of engagement. Do we fight? Do we go in? How do we respond to this act of aggression versus this act of aggression, versus like, hey, what do you do with a drone strike? I mean, they're not precision instruments, right? You blow shit up with missiles is what you do with drones. And so he's very critical of the idea of a pilot cipher. A cipher as in there's not really much there. Pilot cipher unburdened by aught, unburdened by anything but fuel and bombs. And goes on to call the pilot fool of God, savage, idiot, savant. And then at the end, sucking your benumbed trigger finger gamer's thumb. So there's a whole lot of criticism packed in 3 little lines there at the end, right? So there's a few. So for one thing, it drives the metaphor home super explicitly. Your gamer's thumb, like you've got a gamer's thumb here. You're not even what do you call it? The war is a video game. You're not a soldier. You're a gamer. And then sucking your benumbed trigger finger. Well, gamers, I'm a gamer. I'm old, but I'm a gamer. What is it that makes your fingers numb from playing a video game? Well, playing it too much, right? So the idea that the drone, pilot, this is not his first rodeo today. He's probably done this quite a bit to the point that his trigger finger is numb. And of course, we can't skip over the obvious metaphor: sucking your benumbed trigger finger. So of course, that's a very natural human response when you have, like anyone ever burn your thumb on the stove or something. But of course, the mental image there, what is that? That reminds us of a baby. So the idea that the last bit is helping to infantilize the drone pilot as well. Unburdened by anything but fuel and bombs, full of God, savage idiot savant, sucking your benumbed trigger finger gamer's thumb. So it's like, not saying you have to agree with it. It's just the poem, but it seems to be saying like, hey, drone pilot, you're not a soldier. You are basically, a child gamer, just sucking his thumb and not realizing the destruction you are causing. So. But I think that's about it for this poems. Like I said, I hope you don't feel like we're cutting the discussion short or anything. Somebody at this point, somebody's probably looking at the video length and I'm not short at all. No, but this was a collection of poems where most of them weren't subtle. We have poems where it's like, what did they mean by that? We need to unpack, all these complex metaphors. And this is just like, we've got one war is good poem. We've got one, the soldiers are good, but their leadership, their military leadership is awful. And then we have 2 poems that are just in your face. Actually, war sucks, full stop. So interesting set of perspectives as always. And speaking of as always, y'all know the drill. If you have any questions, it could be about the poems we've been covering, the videos, the essay you're working on, feel free. You can always text me, 863-835-2399. You can always email me, and look forward to reading your papers. Bye.